Hey there guys, today I want to look at a vehicle which recently got a massive rework done, the F-16A ADF. Previously, this F-16 variant was sitting at 12.7 and was armed with Sparrows and AIM-9Ls, but Gaijin saw fit to bump it up to 13.3 and give it access to a loadout of 6 AIM-120 AMRAAMs. That increase in battle rating might sound a little bit intimidating, so I'm sure some of you are wondering, is it still any good? Well, to that I would tell you, the best way to describe it in my opinion would not be good, but rather absolutely fucking bonkers. You're getting 6 of what many people would describe as the best all-around Fox 3s in the game, mounted on what I think is now the number 4 best airframe in a sustained dogfight in the game, behind the F2, the Rafale, and the Eurofighter. Given that Gaijin is constantly screwing around with flight models, you may want to double check whether that's still true if you're watching this a few months post-upload. Just a quick note, the background gameplay you're watching is the Chinese version of this aircraft, the F-16A MLU, which in real life is a slightly different variant, but in War Thunder is pretty much the same aircraft for all intents and purposes. The only difference is that it gets a drag chute and has a slightly heavier airframe, so if you're flying the American or Italian ADF, you'll actually have a slightly better flight performance compared to what you see on screen. Anyways, I'm sure I don't really need to go into a lot of detail to explain why the Viper airframe combined with AMRAAMs makes for an incredibly effective combination, but the other thing this aircraft has going for it is the very favorable matchmaker. Currently, 3 of the big 4 tech trees in the game have 12.7 premium Hornets, and the 4th nation, the USSR, has the Su-33 as a squadron vehicle at 13.0. You also have the MiG-29 Sniper and the F-2 ADTW premiums at the same battle ratings. This means that there will be a huge glut of inexperienced players flying aircraft with drastically worse BVR weaponry, sucking you down into down tiers. Admittedly, this may have been a big part of the reason the strategy I adopted with this thing ended up working so well, but we'll get to that a little bit later. First though, there are some drawbacks to this aircraft which we should also talk about. First off, the ADF lacks any sort of short-range IRCCM IR missile like the AIM-9M to pair with its Fox 3s. This can admittedly be a little bit inconvenient at certain times, however I would still advise against wasting a missile slot on an AIM-9L. AMRAAMs are individually just far more lethal missiles, and we can offset this drawback through positioning. Secondly, though this aircraft does have AMRAAMs like other late F-16 variants, this is still an F-16A, and that means you still have the weaker engine, so you do need to be disciplined about your energy and acceleration. The Viper does have great energy retention, but it's not like certain 14.0 or 14.3 aircraft, which have enough thrust to just float around like a UFO. And lastly, you lack a helmet-mounted display. This means, of course, you can't just point and click on your targets, and will need to either actually make use of your radar or just use ACM mode to point your nose at the target you want to lock. And speaking of radar, it's honestly pretty decent, relatively speaking. Granted, all radars are kind of acting buggy and screwy at the moment, so you may want to hard lock targets occasionally, but it will at least pick up targets in TWS mode quite reliably, which isn't a luxury all aircraft are afforded right now, unfortunately. Honestly, in terms of drawbacks, this is all extremely manageable, and I understand that they're necessarily going to have to keep this at a lower BR than the F-16C and the like due to their improvements, but in practice, this really isn't going to hold you back very much. While I definitely did better on average in down tiers, my highest kill match was in an up tier with 6 kills, which shows that even against superior aircraft, with these weapons, you can still very easily come out on top if you play smart. And speaking of which, on to the question I'm sure most of you clicked on this video for: how are you supposed to play this? Well, the first thing to consider is what I mentioned earlier about the engine. As my longtime viewers have heard me say a million times, being fast means your missiles will have more energy and therefore will be more effective. In the ADF though, you simply don't have the same sort of insane acceleration as some of the twin-engined high-tier fighters, and as such, don't be tempted to participate in the early game BVR exchange. Even in down tiers, if you're playing the American or Chinese versions of this thing, you'll have F-14s and J-8Fs with their own Fox 3s, which will be able to get up to high speed much faster, and so are much better suited for the initial BVR exchange. That being said, you still can get quite fast given enough time, and because of that, combined with the relatively large load of BVR missiles this aircraft carries, we're going to be using the ADF to do something which most people seem to not want to do, and that is play defense. Basically, we want to protect the most vulnerable among our teammates from enemies who are trying to close the distance, namely the noobs hugging the deck, and those who participated in the initial BVR exchange who are now notching and going evasive. The first thing you'll want to do right at the start of the match is climb at 10 degrees off to the far left side of the map. Once you reach around 5,000 meters, you'll want to level off and start picking up speed. I know I sound like a broken record saying this, but I find 5,000 meters to just kind of be the ideal altitude to hang out at with many of these high-tier aircraft, because you're low enough to not create a contrail, but high enough that you can really start building up some serious speed. With the ADF, you can get up to around Mach 1.5 if you have sufficient time to accelerate, which isn't anything crazy, but it's definitely enough to give a considerable boost to your missile's range. Once you're at altitude and have picked up speed, that's when we can start looking for enemies. We want to start off by scanning the ground for any enemies who have decided to be contrarians and fly right at low altitude to try and ambush our teammates. For dealing with these opponents and low-flying aircraft in general, I find that AMRAAM shots from right around 16 kilometers while in level flight are the sweet spot. I'm not sure if they've shadow-nerfed multipathing, or maybe it's just because there's been such a huge influx of new players into high tier recently who don't understand how radar missiles work, but I was able to very consistently nail low-level targets by firing using these parameters. If your missile doesn't kill them though, don't bother trying to full commit and follow up with them. In most cases, your shot will have forced them to go evasive to counter it, so you've already done your team a favor by throwing off their attack window. You're not doing anyone any good by giving up your excellent position to deal with a target your teammates can engage anyways. Once you've dealt with any enemies in this position, that's when you can start sweeping the map in a clockwise direction, looking for targets of opportunity. Obviously, your priority targets will be fast-moving enemies at altitude, moving in towards you and your teammates, but you may not encounter any of these types at this stage. Sometimes you'll encounter stragglers who spawned late, and other times you might encounter people trying to land at their auxiliary field after firing off all their BVR missiles. These enemies will be very easy pickings considering their energy disadvantage, and in case of the auxiliary field landers, it's usually best practice to just pick them off with your cannon. If you don't find anyone over here though, the other targets you want to keep an eye out for are people at high altitude engaging in BVR with their teammates. At this point in the match, many of these pilots at high altitude will have bled out a lot of their energy, and if you've kept your speed up, you'll be in a very good position to nail them with an AMRAAM, since many will not be expecting to be shot at from low and off to the side. For high altitude targets, I would recommend getting to within 20 kilometers for your shot if possible. If you're at 5,000 meters and are still fast, the missile is going to quickly loft itself into thinner air, meaning it will still have a ton of energy even over considerable distance. It's at this very last stage of the match when you want to be especially careful though. If the match has devolved into a furball, people are going to be much slower, and as such, they'll be able to notch your AMRAAMs much easier. These would be the types of situations where having something like an AIM-9M would be very helpful, but since you only have access to 9Ls, I still recommend taking a full AMRAAM loadout, since AMRAAMs are just going to be drastically more lethal individually overall. You can still use your AMRAAMs for these types of close-range shots though. Do remember that these are still 35G missiles with good acceleration, and I've gotten kills from less than 2 kilometers before. Just try to aim for targets flying either directly towards you or away from you in order to achieve the highest possible hit probability. And if it does come down to a straight up gunfight, here are a few things to keep in mind. First off, while I did say the F-16A was one of the best aircraft in the game for a sustained dogfight, be aware that at some speeds, aircraft like the Gripen and the Hornet can still pull inside of you. For this reason, consider keeping the fight in the vertical if possible, or otherwise employ spiral climbs and energy traps to bleed them out of energy. This means being disciplined with your turn rate, though, because, like I said, you don't have unlimited thrust, so if you pull too hard for too long, you can still stall yourself out. Overall, I'd say the ADF is one of the stronger aircraft for its BR in the game at the moment. You're basically taking top-tier firepower down to premium noob central on an incredibly competitive dogfighting airframe, meaning you're going to have a huge advantage in terms of both experience and performance in most situations. I was getting at least 2 kills the majority of matches I played with this thing, and in most of the cases where I didn't, I was getting at least 1 kill and 1 assist. This is a very consistently strong aircraft, and I like that it mostly comes down to skill rather than luck when it comes to doing well with it. If you're an American main and are on the fence about going down either the Navy line or the F-16 line, here's your sign, just go for the F-16s. I reviewed the Bombcat recently, which despite having Fox 3s at 1 BR rung lower, still gets absolutely curb stomped. ADF all day long. Also, while the 13.7 F-16s are a bit different obviously, the same strategy should still work mostly with them too. I got plenty of 3 or 4 kill matches even in full up tiers with this version. Anyways, that's gonna wrap it up for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the playlist in the description for more similar content, and I'll see you guys in the next one.